Koga is Head of Division and Associate Professor at the Public Policy and Global Affairs Program at the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University. Currently, he is a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asia Research in the United States and a member of the Research Institute for Peace and Security Research Committee in Japan. His research primarily focuses on international security, international/regional institutions, particularly ASEAN and East Asian Indo-Pacific security. He received his PhD in International Relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Phillip Lipscy is Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, where he is also Chair in Japanese Politics and Global Affairs and the Director for the Center of the Study of Global Japan at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. In addition, he is cross-appointed as Professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Tokyo. His research addresses topics such as international cooperation, international organizations, the politics of energy and climate change, international relations of East Asia, and the politics of financial crises. Previously, Lipscy was Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. He obtained his PhD in Political Science at Harvard University. He received his MA in International Policy Studies and BA in Economics and Political Science at Stanford University. William Grimes is Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. He has published articles, books, monographs, and commentary on East Asian financial regionalism, the impacts of financial globalization in Japan, Japanese monetary policy making, the U.S.-Japan relations, and related topics. Professor Grimes received his BA in East Asian Studies from Yale University, his MPA in International Relations from the Princeton University School of International and Public Affairs, and his PhD in Politics from Princeton University. He is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations.
We'll start with Phillip, who will give a global perspective, then move on to Kay, who will be focusing a little bit more on the Japan-China dynamics in Southeast Asia. And then I'll sort of do some question and answer with them for a little while, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So please do think about what you might want to find out from these people, but in the meantime, listen to what they have to say, because they may tell you from the beginning and generate even more interesting questions. So, Phillip?
Great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'd like to extend my thank yous to the Japan Society of Boston, to Najas, Statecraft Peace Foundation, as well as Andrew and Naoko, and Professor Grimes and Professor Koga, as well as all of you in the audience today. It's really great to see such a large turnout for today's talk. So I'll begin by talking about the general context that we find ourselves in. There's a fairly common narrative at this point that the international order is in a state of crisis, or at least a state of disruption. There are several factors that are cited here. Of course, there's the rise of autocratic challengers like China and Russia. There are concerns about disengagement by core countries that used to underpin the rules-based order, including the United States, particularly during the administration of Donald Trump, but perhaps in some ways even during the current administration with the chip wars and so forth. Of course, there's Brexit, which is the other one that often gets cited there. If you look at democracy in the world, the Varieties of Democracy project suggests that the share of people living under autocracy increased over the past 15 years or so, from about half to about 70%. So there's considerable democratic backsliding in the world as well. And of course, there's also concern about a backlash against globalization, deglobalization, probably that we can trace back to the 2008 financial crisis, but that has arguably accelerated with the trade wars we saw between the US and China, and the rise of so-called new industrial policy that seeks to create more production activities at home across countries. There are various sources of dissatisfaction with the order. And I think there's a perception among many actors that the system is rigged. You hear this kind of language in the United States, but in other places as well. And the question is, of course, who is the system rigged against? So some would say, oh, the system is actually rigged in favor of countries like the United States and its allies, right? The global south is underrepresented and doesn't have commensurate voice in global institutions. But others would say actually it's rigged in favor of China. Right? During the COVID pandemic, there were accusations that the WHO was allowing China to call the shots and that this led to problems in pandemic response. Others would say it's not about countries, but the system is rigged in favor of wealthy elites, and the system isn't working for the sake of regular citizens like it might have in an earlier period after World War II. There are also concerns about perceived free riding by US allies. This is a long-standing concern, but very much in the conversation that perhaps European allies and Japan should step up and share a greater part of the burden of maintaining the order. And I think here we have seen significant changes in recent years in terms of defense expenditures and commitments to do more. But on the other hand, the burdens have also grown with the conflict in Ukraine and now Israel-Palestine. There's only so much burden to go around, even if we see countries stepping up. And finally, there's a perceived dysfunction of some of the core international organizations that underpin the rule-based order. The World Trade Organization, of course, has stalled in the Doha round for over 20 years. The UN Security Council, after a period of activity after the end of the Cold War, looks like it might be back in a situation of stalemate as the new Cold War between the US and its allies on the one hand and Russia and China on the other accelerates. So where does Japan fit into all of this? So for many years, Japan has been an active contributor, albeit a quiet one, to the international order. Oftentimes, Japan was willing to come up with interesting initiatives, whether it be APAC or the Asian Development Bank or the Asian Monetary Fund. These are all Japanese ideas originally, but Japan was oftentimes willing to let some other country take the credit for these initiatives. Japan has, of course, been a longstanding US ally. Active contributions to global public goods like UN peacekeeping operations in recent years, or since the 1990s, I should say. And of course, supporting US overseas operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, among other domains. Japan has been also a member and an active contributor to international organizations, whether it be the WTO, IMF, or World Bank. And if you look at Japanese society, I think it's fair to say at both the elite level and at the level of your ordinary citizen, there is very strong support for the basic principles of the rules-based international order. Today, I would say Japan is, deserves more attention for playing a somewhat more proactive role. And here, we can point to, that quiet era, somewhat having been related to a sense in Japan that during World War II, Japan had invaded its neighbors and so forth, so perhaps other countries should be the face of new initiatives. And today, I think Japan is much more willing to put an imprint on new ideas. And we can see this new face of Japanese leadership, for example, in the resuscitation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement as the CPTPP when the US pulled out. During an era of concerns about declining trade, Japan stepped up with the European Union to create an economic partnership agreement. And Japan has been promoting a partnership for quality infrastructure as one answer to the challenge posed by China's Belt and Road Initiative. And aside from that, Japan has been strengthening various forms of regional cooperation, whether it be the Quad or traditional means of cooperation like the G7 and APEC. one key contribution of Japan has been the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This was a vision originally articulated under the government of Shinzo Abe, and it was eventually adopted by the United States and many other like-minded countries. And so, it's sort of a rare instance, I would say, of a Japanese initiative having that kind of widespread impact and reach in the foreign policy thinking of so many countries. And we could think of the free and open Indo-Pacific as one answer to how to manage the rise of China and to minimize the disruptions that China's rise poses in a way that can contribute to the stability of the international order. The concept, of course, expands the notion of the Asia-Pacific to include the Indian Ocean and India into the picture. And it places emphasis on very fundamental principles, including things like the rule of law, quality infrastructure, connectivity, and other principles that uphold the rules-based order. That said, I think the free and open Indo-Pacific can be criticized as somewhat vague. It's not entirely clear what it is. It's not an institution. But nonetheless, I think that strategic ambiguity to some degree has allowed for broad-based buy-in and participation, which was in many ways Japan's intent. Now, we should also keep in mind the impact of the war in Ukraine, which in many ways is a watershed moment for Japan's foreign policy thinking. I think in the Indo-Pacific, the war in Ukraine has created a sense of urgency. It's, in Japan, for certain, led to discussions about, could this type of thing happen here? Do we need to be more concerned about potential aggression, for example, by China or North Korea? It brought more realism to those kinds of conversations. In Japan today, there are much more intense discussions of a potential Taiwan contingency and the role that Japan might play. And in a concrete terms, for example, the potential evacuation of the Okinawa Islands is being discussed in the event that something happens regarding Taiwan. It's also served as a major turning point for Japanese defense policymaking. It led to the Kishida government abandoning formally the old informal norm that defense spending would be around 1% of GDP. They've lifted that to 2%. It's not quite a doubling of expenditures because there's some accounting that goes into it, but it is a substantial increase in military spending commitments. And Japan is also seeking to increase a variety of capabilities, including counter-strike, cybersecurity, and space as a new domain of defense policy as well. Nonetheless, there has been important public backlash against some of these policies, not necessarily the idea that Japan should have a more robust defense policy, but the funding. The Japanese public is not particularly interested, as public opinion polling will tell you, in paying higher taxes to fund this kind of more proactive defense policy. And that leaves the future a little bit uncertain, in my view. Will Japan be able to finance this very ambitious policy transformation? Remains an open question. Japan is also saddled with a large public debt burden that traces back all the way to the 1990s and the lost decade, as well as a declining population. And at the end of the day, Japan's economy is considerably smaller than that of China. So it's not clear, even with an increase in defense expenditures on the order of 60%, whether it could really make a substantive difference in the balance of power. In that sense, US support remains absolutely critical for both regional stability and Japanese national security. Here, I think there's some complacency in Japan about a potential Trump administration in the United States, because I think relative to other countries, the Abe government handled Trump relatively well. At least that's the perception in Japan. And things didn't turn out terribly badly in Japan. But I don't think there's much of a guarantee that that'll remain the case moving into the future in a potential second Trump administration. And I think in terms of political leadership, we've seen after Abe a very short-term government under Suga, only lasting about a year, And Kishida's popularity rating is now very low, about 20%. So political instability may hamper the potential for Japan to continue to play an active leadership role. So I would like to conclude by saying we should keep in mind that Japan is playing an increasingly proactive role in international affairs, and it's something to be welcomed, but that it's critical to continue strengthening bilateral ties between the United States and Japan, because Japan certainly cannot do it alone, and the U.S. commitment to maintaining regional stability is absolutely critical for peace and prosperity in the region. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Koga from the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. I'm actually glad to be here in Boston because I was the PhD Fletcher School student 10 years ago, and since then it's been already more than 10 years, and then it's actually been 10 years since I was here last time. So I'm glad to be back here, and then I'm really glad to actually talk about this important topic on the Japan's strategic kind of perspective, as well as I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the perspectives from the Southeast Asia. So as first, I'd like to kind of thank the Japan Society of Boston and the NAJES for having this the opportunity, and also I'd like to thank the Sasaka Peace Foundation that is the co-sponsored this event. I think most of the broader the perspective and also important the information was already presented by Professor Phillip Lipscy. So what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to focus on more the kind of specific one about the Japan's and also Southeast Asian's perspective on the economic statecraft, which was titled in this seminar, and then how they actually think about China's economic influence in the region and beyond. So basically two really quick point I would like to make is that on the one hand, Japan has been concerned about so Japan was more like keen to know or eager to respond to China's growing economic influences, and also they were more concerned about China's economic statecraft, which I'm going to talk a bit more about it later. But on the other hand, if you look at the Southeast Asian perspective, that's actually a really different story, because the Southeast Asia were more kind of benefiting from the great power competition in terms of the economic cooperation. And then they were also, right now, yes, I need to actually say this, but the Southeast Asia was a bit concerned about China's growing influence, but then basically they actually see more positive side of China's kind of economic engagement with the region. So I'd like to talk a bit of some points that for Japan and also the Southeast Asian view. For Japan, it's basically the negative. I think China's engagement, China's kind of economic statecraft was actually negatively affected to its own interests. Starting from the very first one, the 2010, right? I mean, in 2010, Japan had the Senkaku issue with China. The Japanese two Coast Guard ships actually collided with the Chinese fishery boat, and then since then at that time, China started to have more kind of economic coercion by putting economic sanctions on Japan regarding the rare earths. That rare earths, Japan was actually dependent on China. Almost like 90% of the rare earths was coming from China. So in that sense, even though China's kind of economic sanction lasted for almost like two months or so, but it was still a big effect and a shock to Japan. And second one is China's growing influence in the region. I mean, if you take a look at Japan's status in the East Asia and in Southeast Asia, Japan was known as the strong kind of supporter for the regional economic development and social stability. Japan provided the offshore defense assistance, and then they actually created the infrastructure in those countries. But then because of China's growing the economic power, China becomes the one of the alternatives to those regions. And China actually started to have more engagement and also have the more strong relation with the Southeast Asia. And then lastly, you could actually see the Belt and Road Initiative was launched in the 2013, which was actually really welcomed by most of the Southeast Asian countries. So in that sense, if you take a look at the kind of trend of the Japan, the China relations, the Japan's kind of relative power was influence was declining, while the China was actually increasing. And I probably should touch on this earlier. In the very kind of important case that the Japan still kept in mind was the 2015 Indonesian Bandung Jakarta railway construction bidding, which actually eventually China won over Japan, and even though Japan actually put lots of effort to win this bid because it was the kind of symbolic effect on the infrastructure development in Southeast Asia. Indonesia really wanted it, but then Indonesia actually chose China. And again, this was the kind of really the Japan got shocked, and Japan was not clear at that time. I think Suga, that was the cabinet officer, Suga actually mentioned that that was that he couldn't believe it, and he was not really sure of why Indonesia chose China also. So there was again politically and symbolically and also economically, China's economic influence was growing in the region. And then thirdly, from the Trump era, 2017. The United States started to have more kind of competition over the technology issues, and then Japan was more closely aligned with the United States than China. And then the tech cooperation with the United States was so strong that Japan started to actually stay a little bit away from the China's tech companies too. So if you again those kind of 3 points suggest that Japan's growing concern about China's growing influence in the region and beyond. So that was Japan, and the economic statecraft was the really important issue right now, as the Prime Minister Kishida emphasized the importance of the economic security currently. But from the Southeast Asian perspective, I'm going to be just kind of quickly touch on this, but those are a little bit different. Again, the Southeast Asia was pretty much appreciates China's engagement in the region. That actually started off from the 1997, the Asian financial crisis, when the Asia suffered lots of the economic difficulties, while the United States and Western countries started to impose more kind of coercive measure to change the economic structure in the Asian economies. And the reason, there's a certain reason why the United States and the Western kind of countries didn't want to bail out. Because of there are certain kind of the government intervention in the free market and so on and so forth. So there was a reason, but at that time the Southeast Asia country was really fragile in terms of politically and also economically. And what happened was that some of the regime actually collapsed, such as the Indonesia and so on. And then the Southeast Asia was actually in mess. So at that time, like what they actually wanted to have was a stability, and then what they actually saw was China's presence, and then China actually started to have more kind of cooperative actions, such as not devaluating the yuan, so that like they didn't compete with the Southeast Asian economy in terms of the trade and so on and so forth. So that was the great kind of positive the impression that China actually put in the Southeast Asia, and since then the Southeast Asian countries started to cooperate more closely with the China. As I said, 2013, when the Southeast Asian countries saw the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, then that was also the great opportunity for Southeast Asian countries to build their infrastructure without actually adhering to the kind of international standard, right? International standard meaning when you get the development aid, you have to do kind of environmental protection, labor rights, and human rights, those kind of all stuff. But then there are certain countries which were not able to actually adhere those kind of conditions so easily, and the Chinese kind of alternative actually helped the Southeast Asian countries a lot. So there are certain kind of positive trajectory over that. But at the same time, as we actually see, as we know that there are also Southeast Asian countries are not monolithic, it's not united. Some of the countries like the Philippines and Vietnam or like even Malaysia, Indonesia, they had their territorial disputes within the South China Sea, and they also had a different kind of like the degree of the interaction with China. So those countries which had the disputes with China had a different kind of like the perspective as well. They are trying to gain more from the Chinese economic growth, but then at the same time they have to be really careful because otherwise you're gonna be too dependent on China, and then China might use those kind of dependency as a tool to influence your domestic and foreign policies. So that actually happened in 2012 when the Philippines faced the big kind of the maritime confrontation in the Scarborough Shoal in South China Sea, and then China actually put the sanction on the Philippines. I mean, they didn't actually import the banana, and that was the kind of good, but impact on the Philippines the economy, and then also when some of the countries like Singapore touched on the importance of the international law in South China Sea, China didn't actually invite Singapore to the Belt and Road Initiative conference in 2016 and so on and so forth. So there are certain kind of different way to put the sanctions on the Southeast Asian countries. So it's more kind of now like the Southeast Asian kind of countries see the more mixed feeling about the China's engagement. They are welcoming, but they have to be really cautious about it. So what I actually wanted to say here is there are certain kind of the perspectives in Asia about the Chinese economic statecraft, but they are not actually united. I think that we have to understand those kind of like the differences, because at the end of the day, they may actually have the longer term the implications of their kind of the relations with China and the United States. So I'll stop here.
So thank you. Can I just ask a first question of Naoko-san? We started a little bit late. Are we stopping hard at 1 o'clock, or I want to make sure that the people get a chance to ask the questions they want.
A few minutes over.
Okay. I will keep an eye on the timer. So before we pass it out to questions, so please start thinking about them. I have a couple questions that I wanted to run past our guests today. They have to do a little bit more with the title and thinking about this thing that we call the Indo-Pacific, which I think there's quite a little bit of uncertainty about. And so maybe just to start with Kay, sitting down there in Singapore, does this region make sense? Like, in what way does it make sense? We've had competing visions. There's the East Asia region. There's the Asia-Pacific region. Now we're sitting on this Indo-Pacific region, which seems to be Asia-Pacific minus China. and mainly possibly some inland Southeast Asia, and throw Russia out of the picture too. But what does this region make sense, and in what ways does it make sense?
Thank you very much. That's actually a really, really important question on the from the Southeast Asia. I think the perspectives, because that actually depends on whom you want to actually talk to. If you talk to the Indonesia, maybe that makes sense because Indonesia has the both kind of facing both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and then this is a country which actually started off the Indo-Pacific terminology in the ASEAN Southeast Asian countries. But then the reaction the Indonesia got from the other Southeast Asian countries are not like really positive, because in the Pacific it doesn't really make sense, because some of the countries are more focused on Southeast Asia, and some of them are more like the East Asia as a whole. So in that sense, it actually depends on whom like you ask. Probably it makes sense again like the Indonesia. Basically, I think like the Indonesia, and then most of the countries are actually looking at the Asia Pacific and the East Asia. So the one kind of quick anecdote that like I actually want to talk about is the ASEAN kind of ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which was created in 2019, and then seemingly the Indo-Pacific was accepted as a term, the strategic term that they use diplomatically, but it is more like kind of reaction to the Indo-Pacific term created or used by the Western countries and also Japan, because those Indo-Pacific term, the U.S. kind of Indo-Pacific was more like kind of counter China, and then that's kind of a connotation the Southeast Asian countries possess, and which they don't want. They don't want to actually exclude China. They actually want to have more kind of terminology that could include the Indo-Pacific. And the other China, and I think that's why when they started to use the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, it actually emphasized a lot the inclusivity. And then by doing so, they are actually indicating they are not using the Indo-Pacific the United States use, or like the Japan use, or India use. It's more like the Indo-Pacific that the Southeast Asian country defines. So I guess I mean it makes sense, but then it's more kind of reactive to the term from the Southeast Asian perspective.
So thanks. So in other words, the Indo-Pacific is most useful for creating a sense of region when everybody gets to have their own definition. Okay, so Phillip, following up on this, choose your version of the region, but what do we see as prospects for meaningful cooperation? So the IPAF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, which is formerly the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, has been going through a series of working group discussions on the 4 pillars. I don't remember what they all are, but one of them is trade, and another one is digital economy, and something else. The trade one seems to include exactly 0 additional access to the U.S. market, which is probably the real trading benefit that one could offer from the U.S. side. So what are the prospects, as a well-known scholar of international organizations, for how do you see this working as a process of international cooperation and also interacting with some of the other ones that are already going on in the East Asia, Asia Pacific areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I agree with Kay completely in the malleability of the concept of the Indo-Pacific across different countries. And it's almost something that's by design, which is to say, the concept is not very well defined. There's a map that I show to my students that comes from the Japanese Ministry of Defense annual report, and it says this is the Indo-Pacific, and it includes, of course, Japan and the United States and Australia, but it also includes the United Kingdom and France,
The East Coast of Africa.
And the East Coast of Africa. And so it begs the question of, okay, so what is not the Indo-Pacific? And so, in some sense, intentionally vague so that you can get very broad buy-in. Partly, and so initially the Japanese government called it a strategy, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, and they toned it down to a vision, partly because of concerns from Southeast Asian countries that strategy sounded too aggressive. It's like an anti-China strategy. So they toned it down to vision and intentionally leave the principles very vague. There's a slide from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, again, that I show to my students sometimes, where they talk about the fundamental principles of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, and it says something like, rule of law, open sea lanes, and comma, etc. And if they're fundamental principles, maybe you should talk about them instead of having an etc. at the end. But I think this is part of a strategy. So does it include human rights? Does it include democracy? Maybe, but maybe not. And so I think this goes directly to your question, which is, it would seem attractive in some sense to try to institutionalize this type of cooperation within the Indo-Pacific. But I think it would be quite difficult because the visions for what is the Indo-Pacific and what should cooperation within this new region look like, those are hard questions. And to some extent, I think Japan and other countries have adopted this phrase and converged on the notion of a region, partly by avoiding answering these hard questions. And so I am a little bit pessimistic in terms of deep cooperation around this notion. I think what we're going to see is a continuation of smaller, mini-lateral type cooperation along the lines of the Quad. Certainly the existing frameworks like APEC will continue. But is there going to be some dramatic new Indo-Pacific organization or something like that? I would say highly unlikely at this stage.
So I think it's quite interesting to think about the ways in which this notion of Indo-Pacific or other notions of region fit into Japan's own economic statecraft and its ability or its interest in trying to maintain prosperity through regionalization, trying to maintain security by keeping people, giving disincentives across the region to aggression, etc. But we're going to turn it to you, and I should just say the lights up here are extremely bright, so I may not actually recognize who you are, even if I know you. So please raise your hand. I'll try to see if you may have to raise it pretty high, and when I do call on you, please do identify yourself and ask a relatively brief question. If you don't want to direct it to one of the people on the stage, then I may just do that in order to get as many questions as possible. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Russell Nickerson from Mass Robotics. Just talking about, I think one of the things that was kind of surprising to hear about is like the energy. So like in Japan, I think over 80% of like the import is energy. Oil is like a big issue. I think with technology moving forward, we'll see more renewables and solar and countries getting more energy under wraps internally, so they don't have to depend on that. Any comments on that?
This one's definitely Phillip.
You want to take a few or should I?
We could actually. That's a good idea. Let's collect a couple more, but keep that one in your mind. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Grant. I'm retired. In November, it was reported that Japan and the Philippines begun the process of developing closer military ties. Would you characterize that as a mini-lateral move, or is there a relevance to it that I'm not thinking of?
Thank you. So I'm going to give that one to you. And can I have one more? You had your hand up. Yes, the young woman there.
Hi, Caitlin. I'm student partner. I was just wondering,
Can you speak a little louder? Sorry, we're getting older up here.
how do you approach studying Southeast Asia as a region and its like future relations with the U.S., Japan, China? When, as you mentioned, it's really not monolithic. It's every country has such different political structures, economic backgrounds. I'm just curious how you approach like researching and figuring out the dynamics of that region.
Thank you. So I think we'll stop with those three, and I'll start with Kay and ask you to do the two Southeast Asia ones. One note about Southeast Asia is that this is the perennial challenge of Southeast Asia, and one of the reasons why ASEAN exists and has persisted is that need to triangulate among the great powers. And it was first U.S. Russia, then it's sort of more U.S. Japan, then U.S. Japan Russia, China. Now we're down to China somebody, right? So, and as you say, with quite different interests, and yet somehow maintaining some sort of sense of region. So please.
Thank you very much. So there are two questions on the one the Japan Philippines cooperation. I guess right now they are trying to strengthen the the security tie between the Japan and the Philippines. They have the already 2+2 meeting, that is the defense minister and also the foreign ministers kind of talk. And then also they started to have the conversation with regard to the military defense equipment and technology transfer, and also now like they are negotiating the another kind of the defense pact for the reciprocal the access agreement. So in that sense, the two countries are getting closer. Probably because it's something to do with the China, but at the same time, they are actually more cooperating in terms of the dealing with the non-traditional security issues, such as the natural disasters. But I guess those are kind of dual-used kind of cooperation. On the one hand, you can use the non-traditional cooperation, but then on the other hand, like you could actually utilize those kind of cooperation for the strategic purpose as well. So in that sense, they are really strengthening ties. And also they know that the United States is important because the US is an ally of the Philippines and also the Japan. So they are creating the trilateral right now, the US, Japan, and also the Philippines. And that is actually, I think, the one of the minilateral we could actually see in the East Asia. And then I don't know to what extent they're gonna actually be institutionalized, but I guess this is the kind of important the topic to look at because this may have certain kind of impact in the Northeast Asian kind of balance of power too. So that's the one thing. And then the Southeast Asian the view and also the trend. I guess you are right, and then Professor Graham is also right. Southeast Asia has the kind of differing perspectives, but then somehow they try to get together and then to push back the kind of the pressures coming from the great powers, including the China, United States, and Japan, and other regional powers. So the reason why they actually started to have those kind of the ASEAN or the unified front to some extent is because they want to have the regional autonomy that actually was kind of not like gained during the colonial period. I mean, there's a certain kind of like the embedded the colonial experiences in their kind of memories, so that they actually have the motivation to get close to each other. But the one thing is as most of the Southeast Asian countries developed economically and then politically, they became a little bit more independent. They don't have to actually rely on each other to the extent that they used to in the 1960s. So what happened was now I think the Southeast Asian concern was kind of like the potential division, like to what extent they could actually maintain the unified front when they actually really pressured from the upgrade process.
Phillip, on the energy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think the first thing to mention here is that when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, it's important to remember that we're talking about the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And one of the key reasons why at least Japanese policymakers look at the two oceans is because those are the crucial sea lanes through which Japan's energy resources travel. And so maintaining open access and stable connections across those two oceans is a very important priority for Japan, as well as many other countries that depend on those sea lanes. In terms of Japanese policymaking on energy, of course, the 2011 Fukushima disaster was a very critical event, And it's only just recently that public opinion polling suggests that the Japanese public now supports nuclear restarts. And Kishida has announced that perhaps they'll even consider new nuclear construction. This is going to happen over a very long time frame. But for the first time in some years, it looks like Japan may have more of a serious nuclear program than before. And so sitting in Canada, there's quite active conversations going on about whether Canada can provide technology for small-scale nuclear power plants that Japan can utilize, for example. But across the different types of energy sources, there is very active conversations about LNG. Of course, Japan relied on Russia for much of its LNG, and that doesn't look like a very attractive energy source these days. One area that's been controversial has been coal. In light of climate change concerns, Japan's support for coal-fired power plants domestically and in its foreign aid had come under very intense criticism from climate-related NGOs. And so the government has tried to step back gradually, although not completely, on that front, but trying to balance Japan's own energy needs. Obviously, it's not a country with plenty of natural resources, with trying to combat climate change remains a very important area for Japanese policy making as well as international cooperation. Thank you.
Why don't we collect a couple more? So there's a gentleman in the way back, and then there's you. Thank you. So, yeah.
So it seems like
And sorry, can you identify yourself?
Sorry. Stephen Backwater, Corporate Intelligence. It seems like the current American vision for Japan is to serve as a buffer against Chinese power growth in the Indo-Pacific region. The challenge for that, of course, is under the military funding issue that Professor Lipscy mentioned, is Japan's dependence on trade. Do Japanese elites have any sort of self-generated vision for Japan, or are they sort of resigned to Japan defining themselves in the context of U.S.-China rivalry?
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm Chikabu Ueki. I'm based at MIT and also at Waseda. I have a vulgar question. I would like you to evaluate the sort of the policies and strategies that you've explained and whether it's working. I think the objective probably was to maintain the status quo and also to try to not let China break that too much. And we do obviously see many corporations happening, many efforts, but as you mentioned, some of the aid still attaches somewhat this flagship of free and open. Two ways of evaluating aid, do you think it changed anything of the China's behavior? Probably not. So more importantly, do you think it's increased U.S. and Japanese influence, positive influence through the region, and maybe Southeast Asia would be a place to?
So we'll start. I think maybe I'll have you start with the question of the problem of balancing the country while you're and maybe even villainizing it in our case while you're still deeply dependent on it. And the same goes for China, of course. China's just as involved in villainizing the U.S. and is just as dependent on the U.S. as we are the other way. So obviously this creates some important dynamics. And I think that Professor Wacky's question, of course, is very good too. And I think a kind of an uncomfortable way of forcing us to reflect on this question of what does it mean for Japan to be effective in its economic statecraft, and what are the actual prospects of this thing working? And partly what do we mean by working? So I think maybe both of you can take a crack at that one. But Philip, why don't you start with the China one?
Yeah, so I think Japan certainly does not see itself as a buffer. Perhaps there might be some U.S. officials who look at things this way. Although I don't necessarily think that's a dominant view within U.S. policymaking circles either. But certainly, even during the Abe government, the policy towards China was multifaceted and complex. Relations with China improved considerably under Abe, and he met with Putin 16 times to try to negotiate an agreement on the northern territories. So, Japan, has adopted a policy that is quite nuanced in that sense. It's not an anti-China policy. It is very much an attempt to try to deal with China's rise, which is not like the Soviet Union, right? It is occurring in a context of mutual interdependence and supply chain integration and geoeconomic policy making. And so, I think that is important to make clear. That Japan is not adopting this U.S. view of China as the military threat and something to be countered on all fronts, as some I've heard U.S. military officials describe it in those kinds of terms. It is a much more of a balanced approach, and I think that continues under the Kishida government as well. And in some sense, I think this may be the right strategy, and so this might connect with Wixen's point that an overly confrontational strategy vis-a-vis China is probably not the solution. The world economy is too integrated, and we're talking about very high stakes, right? Sometimes I show my students a chart where you add up the GDP of the initial combatants during World War I and World War II, and then just the US, China, and Japan. And basically it's the same, right? You're talking about 40% of the world economy. So if there's a direct conflict between these three countries, it's immediately World War III. And so, if you think about the stakes, you have to be focused on how do you manage these relations. And so I do think Japan deserves credit for providing one potential answer to that, is we don't push back aggressively and directly, but in areas where we really need to uphold the international order and the rule of law and so forth, there we take a firm stand. But in other areas, like economic cooperation, we adopt a policy of greater flexibility. And I think the Biden administration has tried to do this in some ways. But on the Chinese side, at least from having talked to some Chinese observers, their sense is that, well, you can't play those games at the same time. If you're going to sanction our defense minister, you can't, on the one hand, come and say we want to do economic cooperation, right? So whether China is ultimately willing to play ball on those kinds of terms perhaps remains to be seen.
And arguably, Japan is intellectually well equipped not to fall into a containment trap.
Yes.
Its containment was never a natural approach for Japan. And I'll just say, when I started graduate school in the late 1980s at Princeton, we had all these brilliant Japanese bureaucrats, economic bureaucrats who came in. The very first class of Introduction to International Relations, we learned about nuclear deterrence. And I remember these just brilliant people, and they came out and they were so confused. They're like, why would you want to target civilians? Like their heads were exploding. And I think that now, though, Japan really is shifting more towards a notion of strategy that's not just economic strategy. The economic strategy has been there a long time. We have great examples going back 60s, 70s, 1980s. But now, one of the interesting things I think about this notion of economic statecraft is that it's not just for economic purposes and sort of generalized diplomatic purposes and hiving to the United States, but Japan is making a regional play. And so I think maybe I'll stop at ask the last question, Kay, and I'll ask you what it is in a second. We all want to say so much about this. Is that do the tools of economic statecraft, are they going to be able to accomplish what Japan wants to accomplish when you're looking at either from the Japanese perspective in the region or the regional perspective, looking outward, looking down from Southeast Asia at Japan?
Thank you very much. It's actually really important, but difficult to the answer probably. But again, I guess the really simply put, probably the economic statecraft alone cannot achieve what Japan wants. I think this is a part of the kind of strategy that Japan can pursue to help achieving its national the strategy. And one thing that I would actually indicate about this kind of Japan's economic strategy is that Japan is now like trying to diversify the risk of Chinese economic statecraft. So they don't want to actually be too dependent on their particular issues, particular economic issues on China, and then they actually try to diversify. So they diversify their rare earths, they diversify their trade, they diversify their production network to the Southeast Asia and so on. So in that sense, I think like that helps when the China try to impose more pressure on Japan, then Japan was not like that vulnerable. I actually want to touch on the Southeast Asian thing a little bit more. From Southeast Asian perspective, a really interesting thing is this diversification actually is benefiting to them because production network coming to Southeast Asia, and they can actually gain more by those kind of strategic competition. So some of the countries are not like really happy because the intensification of strategic competition, its implication is probably like really important and deep for their kind of regional stability. But at the same time, from their economic perspective, they are actually quite happy because the other groups are actually looking at them. So yeah.
Thanks. So we're going to wrap up. So thank you very much to the Japan Society of Boston, Director Takayanagi-san, the National Association, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, our wonderful speakers, including, and I have to give a little bit of extra credit to Koga-san, who traveled 27 hours to get here. Thank you.